Everyone has had a night like this. A fever coming up in the dark, skin hot and papery, and somehow shivering underneath it, joints aching deep in the bone, a throat like sandpaper, a head that throbs with every heartbeat. You lie still because moving is worse, and there is nothing to do but wait, helpless, while your body decides on its own whether to fix this or not. It is one of the oldest feelings a human being can have, and it is one of the few things every person who ever lived has shared. Someone was lying exactly like that 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, long before hospitals, before doctors, before the word for medicine existed in any language. So here is the real question. What did a human back then actually do when a fever hit, or a wound went bad, or a tooth turned to fire in their jaw? The short answer is far more than you would think. They were not helpless in the way we imagine. They had real medicine. They had plants that genuinely work, plants whose chemistry we still use in the pills in your bathroom cabinet right now. They had surgery, actual surgery, that people actually survived and lived years afterward, and they had a whole world of ritual and ceremony that we used to dismiss as superstition, but which we are only now realizing worked, and worked for a reason written into the wiring of your own brain. That is the surprising part. The story of ancient sickness is not a story about ignorance. It is a story about how early humans read the world, tested it, remembered it, and passed it on. It is one of the oldest kinds of knowledge we have. And later in this video, I am going to show you a 5,000-year-old human skull with a hole cut clean through the bone. Not a wound, a deliberate hole made by another person on purpose while the patient was alive. And here is the thing that should stop you cold. The bone around that hole had healed. New bone had grown over the edges, which means the person did not die on the table. The person lived for years. We will come back to that skull because it changes everything about what you think ancient people could do. But start small. Start with the simplest thing a sick body wants, which is for the pain to stop. Walk out into almost any temperate forest on Earth, and you will find willow trees near the water. Peel back a strip of the bark and chew it, and it is bitter, unpleasant, faintly medicinal on the tongue. Inside that bark is a compound called salicin. When your body breaks salicin down, it becomes salicylic acid, and salicylic acid quietly lowers fever and dulls pain and calms inflammation. This is not folklore. This is pharmacology. It is the exact chemical ancestor of the aspirin sitting in your cupboard. Now, the astonishing part is not that willow works. It is how many separate peoples figured it out, alone, without ever speaking to each other. The ancient Sumerians wrote of willow for pain on clay tablets. The Egyptians recorded it in the Ebers Papyrus around 1550 BCE, one of the oldest medical documents in existence, listing willow among remedies for aches and swelling. Greeks used it. Hippocrates himself, 24 centuries ago, told women to chew willow leaves to ease the pains of childbirth and fever. Peoples in the Americas, with no contact whatsoever with Egypt or Greece, independently reached for willow for the very same reasons. Think about what that means. Across thousands of miles and thousands of years, human beings kept finding the same bitter bark and kept discovering that it helped. That is not luck. That is a species running the same experiment over and over in isolation and getting the same answer, because the answer was true. The chemistry was always there in the tree. Humans just had to notice it and remember and tell each other. And that pushes the question backward. If organized ancient civilizations had this knowledge, where does it actually start? How far down does it go? Further than the civilizations. Further than farming. Further, it turns out, than our own species. In a cave called El Cedrón in the north of Spain, researchers recovered the remains of Neanderthals who died around 48,000 years ago. Neanderthals are thick-boned cousins, the ones we tend to picture as brutes. And on the teeth of these individuals was dental calculus, hardened plaque, the same crust your dentist scrapes off your teeth, except this crust had been sitting there for 48,000 years, and locked inside it was a molecular record of the last things these people put in their mouths. In 2017, a team led by Laura Weyrich published their analysis in the journal Nature, and what they found stops you in your tracks. One of the Neanderthals had been sick. His jaw showed a dental abscess, a painful infection, and his gut, read through the same calculus, carried a diarrheal parasite. He was suffering, and in his dental plaque were two things he had been consuming that he had no nutritional reason to eat. One was poplar. Poplar bark and leaves contain salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, the very same painkiller as the willow. The other was a penicillium mold, the kind of mold from which we would eventually derive penicillin, the first antibiotic. Sit with that. A sick Neanderthal, 48,000 years ago, long before our species had spread across the world, was consuming a natural painkiller and a natural antibiotic while he was ill. We cannot climb into his head and prove he understood what he was doing, but he was eating bitter, nutrition-poor plants and mold, precisely when he was in pain and fighting infection. The simplest explanation is that he, or his group, knew these things helped, and reached for them on purpose. Self-medication is not a human invention. It may be older than humans. And this is where I promised you the skull. There is a surgery so old and so widespread that when archaeologists first started finding the evidence, many of them refused to believe it. It is called trepanation. It means cutting, drilling, or scraping a hole through the bone of a living person's skull, exposing the tissue beneath, and it is one of the oldest surgical procedures we know of anywhere on Earth. We have trepanned skulls from over 7,000 years ago and older. We find them in France, in the Andes of Peru, in Russia, in China, in North Africa, across the Pacific. Peoples who never met, on continents that never touched, all independently arrived at the same shocking idea, that sometimes you can open a person's head and they will get better. Now here is what makes these skulls almost unbelievable. On a huge number of them, the bone around the hole is not sharp and raw. It is smooth, rounded, regrown. Living bone remodels itself only when the person is alive, and it takes weeks and months and years to do it. So when we see a trepanned skull with smooth, healed edges, we are looking at direct physical proof that the patient survived the operation. Not just survived, lived on for months, for years, their bones slowly closing over the wound the whole time. In some sites, the survival rate is staggering. Study certain groups of prehistoric and ancient skulls, and you find that more than half, in some samples the great majority, show this healing. People were opening skulls with stone and bronze tools, with no anesthetic as you know it, no germ theory, no idea what a bacterium was, and their patients were pulling through at rates that would not have embarrassed a surgeon from a couple of centuries ago. Some Peruvian skulls show 2, 3, even 7 separate healed holes on one head. The same person operated on again and again, surviving each time, coming back for more. We are not entirely sure why they did it. Some cases clearly follow a head injury, a fracture from a club, or a fall, where opening the skull may have relieved deadly pressure from bleeding underneath. That part is real medicine, and it works, and neurosurgeons do a version of it today. Other cases may have been for headaches, seizures, or reasons that were spiritual as much as physical, releasing something believed to be trapped inside. But the reason almost matters less than the fact. Ancient people could cut into the living human skull and keep the patient alive and nurse them through the healing. That requires skill. It requires knowledge passed carefully from one person to the next, and it requires something even bigger, which we are coming to. It requires care. Because a person recovering from a hole in their skull cannot hunt, they cannot gather. For weeks they can barely feed themselves. Someone kept them warm. Someone brought them water and food. Someone sat with them in the dark while they healed. The surgery is impressive. The aftercare is the miracle. Which brings us to the most complete ancient patient we have ever found. His name is Ötzi. In 1991, 2 hikers in the Alps, on the border between Austria and Italy, found a body melting out of a glacier. At first everyone assumed it was some unlucky mountaineer. It was not. It was a man who had died on that mountain around 5,300 years ago, and the ice had kept him almost perfectly. His skin, his organs, his clothes, his tools, his last meal, still in his stomach. We call him Ötzi, the Iceman, and he is the closest thing we will ever have to meeting a living human from the Stone Age. And Ötzi was not well. When scientists examined him, they found his intestines were infested with whipworm, a parasite that causes pain, cramping, and misery. His joints showed wear. His body carried the ordinary suffering of a hard life. But it is what he was carrying with him that matters. Threaded onto leather cords, Ötzi had pieces of a fungus called birch polypore. Birch polypore has genuine antibacterial and antiparasitic properties. It can be used against exactly the kind of parasite squirming in his gut. This man, 5,000 years ago, was walking through the Alps carrying a specific fungus that fights the specific infection he had. That is not decoration. That looks like a medicine kit. And then there are the tattoos. Ötzi's preserved skin carries around 61 tattoos, and they are not pictures. They are simple lines and crosses, and they are not scattered randomly. They cluster over his lower back, his knees, his ankles, his wrist, over the joints, on the exact places where his body showed strain and where he would have felt pain. Many of them fall on points that line up, uncannily, with the pressure points used in acupuncture, a practice we thought was invented in Asia thousands of years later. The leading idea is that these tattoos were therapeutic, that someone repeatedly worked pigment into the skin over Ötzi's aching joints, deliberately, as a treatment for his pain. A 5,000-year-old man walking around with a course of pain therapy written permanently into his skin and a bag of antiparasitic fungus around his neck. He was managing his illness. He was self-medicating and being medicated with real substances that really work. And he lived in a world with no writing, no cities, no metal beyond the copper axe he carried. The knowledge was in his body and in his community, not in any book. So by now the picture has changed completely. The sick ancient human is not lying helpless in the dark waiting to die. They are being treated. There is willow and poplar for the fever and the pain. There is birch polypore and penicillium mold against infection. There is surgery careful enough to open a skull and bring the patient back. There are tattoos and remedies and a whole inherited library of which plant does what. But we have left out the strangest part, and in some ways the most human part. Because alongside all the chemistry, ancient people also healed each other with ritual, with chanting, with ceremony, with a healer who laid hands on you and told you that you would be well. And for a long time we sneered at that. We called it superstition, the part of ancient medicine that was just noise. We were wrong, and to understand why, you have to look inside your own brain. You have almost certainly heard the word placebo. It is usually said dismissively, as if it means nothing, a fake, a sugar pill, all in your head. But that phrase, all in your head, is doing something remarkable that we glossed over for centuries, because your head is where your pain actually lives. Pain is not a simple report from an injured body part. It is a signal built, judged, and dialed up or down by your brain, and your brain can turn it down using drugs it manufactures itself. When you believe you are being cared for, when someone you trust treats you with confidence and ritual and full attention, your brain can release its own opioids, endorphins, chemicals shaped like the strongest painkillers we own, made inside your own skull, flooding the same receptors that morphine locks onto. This is measurable. Give someone a treatment they believe in, and their pain genuinely drops, and if you block the body's opioid system with a drug, that relief can vanish, which proves the relief was real chemistry and not imagination. Belief reaches into the body and moves the machinery. The ritual is not decorating the medicine. Sometimes the ritual is the medicine. Now picture the ancient healer, the shaman, in that light. This person knows the plants, the willow, the fungus, the roots that settle a stomach. But they also know something else, something they could never have named in the language of neuroscience. They know that ceremony works. They know that if a sick, frightened person is surrounded by their people, chanted over, touched, marked, and told with total conviction that the sickness is being drawn out, that person often gets better. The healer is, without any of our vocabulary, deliberately switching on the patient's own internal pharmacy. Every culture on Earth, independently, discovered this too. The drumming, the smoke, the song, the laying on of hands. It kept appearing everywhere because, like the willow, it was tapping something real in the body of every human being. And underneath the ritual sits the simplest and most powerful ingredient of all. Being cared for, not treated, cared for. The fact that when you were useless, someone stayed. We can prove this care goes back almost unimaginably far, because the skeletons tell us. Consider Shanidar I, a Neanderthal man who lived around 45,000 years ago in what is now Iraq. When scientists reconstructed his life from his bones, they found a body that had been shattered and had lived on anyway. He had suffered a crushing blow to the left side of his head, which likely blinded him in one eye. His right arm was withered and useless, possibly amputated above the elbow. He had damage to his legs that would have made him limp badly and in pain. This was a man who could not have hunted, could not have run from danger, could not have survived a single hard winter on his own. And yet his bones show he lived for years with these injuries. Years, which means, for all those years, other Neanderthals fed him, protected him, kept him alive when, by the cold arithmetic of survival, he gave nothing back. He is not alone. Look at the old man of La Chapelle, another Neanderthal who had lost most of his teeth long before he died, his jawbone reshaped where the sockets had closed over. A person with almost no teeth, in a world of tough raw meat and hard roots, does not feed himself easily. Someone was helping him eat. Someone made sure the toothless old man did not starve. These are not stories we are telling. These are conclusions written in bone, the only honest witness there is. And this is the turn. This is the thing the whole story has been walking toward. We tend to think of being sick as pure suffering, an empty stretch of misery to be endured and forgotten. But look at what that misery actually did to our ancestors. Sickness is the pressure that forced humans to learn which plants heal, and to remember it, and to teach it. Injury is what demanded surgeons careful enough to open a skull and patient enough to nurse the wound for months. Pain is what revealed that a trusted voice and a ritual could reach into the body and quiet it. And helplessness, the specific helplessness of the person who can no longer feed themselves, is what asked the hardest question a group of animals can be asked. Do we keep this one alive, even now that they cost us and give us nothing? Every time, the answer, written in those healed bones, was yes. And that yes is one of the oldest human things there is. Older than farming, older than cities, older, in the case of the Neanderthals, than our own species. The willow bark is astonishing. The healed skull is astonishing, but the most astonishing artifact of ancient medicine is not a plant or a tool at all. It is the simple, stubborn, repeated decision to look after someone who could not look after themselves. So go back to where we started. Go back to you, at 3 in the morning, hot and shivering and useless, waiting out the fever in the dark. That feeling of being helpless, of being a burden, of contributing nothing while your body fights its private war, feels like the least human thing imaginable. It is the exact opposite. That moment, the moment of the useless, cared for, waiting it out body, is precisely the moment our ancestors became who we are. It is where they invented medicine. It is where they invented surgery. It is where they invented belief that heals. And it is where they invented the deepest thing of all, which is each other. Being looked after when you are useless to the group is not a weakness in the human story. It is the beginning of it, and it is still happening, in the dark, tonight, everywhere, exactly as it has for 50,000 years.